Okay, welcome back to anthropology. This lesson is about subsistence, and I will explain what that is in the following slides. All right, here's our outline. We're going to talk about different kinds of subsistence, including foraging and some traits of food foraging societies. Then we're going to move on to food production and different types of food production. So another term for subsistence is adaptive strategies. Depending on what textbook you are using and which class you're taking, we might call it adaptive strategies, but it's usually called, in my class, as subsistence. Here are some of the goals of this lesson. You're going to understand definitions of subsistence and adaptive strategies, differentiate between food foraging, horticulture, pastoralism, and agriculture, understand the transition from food foraging to food production, apply your knowledge of subsistence strategies to ethnographic studies of culture, and relate what you have learned about subsistence strategies and cultural adaptations to your society. Okay, food foraging. First, we're going to define cultural adaptations or adaptive strategies or subsistence. Those all are terms that describe kind of the same thing. Okay, so cultural adaptation is basically what it sounds like. Humans must have the ability to constantly make cultural adaptations to better survive and thrive in their natural environment or ecosystem. Cultural adaptations consist of a complex of ideas, activities, and technologies that enable people to survive and even thrive. Through distinctive cultures, different human groups have managed to adapt to a very diverse range of natural environments from the Arctic to the Amazon. So if you have recently viewed my lesson on the sand people of the Kalahari Desert, you would have seen that they store water in ostrich egg shells traditionally. That's an example of a cultural adaptation. So they have adapted to not having water by creating a way to save water. As we talked about previously in the barrel model, humans and their environments or ecosystems come together to form dynamic and interacting systems of culture. Your ecosystem, we often talk about ecosystems when we talk about plants and animals, but humans have an ecosystem as well. An ecosystem is a functioning system that is comprised of both the natural environment and the organisms that inhabit it. So to fit into different ecosystems, humans must find ways to adjust to or become a part of these ecosystems. Humans adapt to different ecosystems through different means of subsistence. So here is your definition of subsistence. It's a ways of getting food, okay? So hunting is a method of a type of subsistence. Farming is a type of subsistence. We are going to break down different types, and it might sound like, why would I want to learn this? But you'll understand as we go through the lesson. And again, you'll remember, I'm using the sand as an example again, they had a type of subsistence called hunting and gathering, or sometimes that's called foraging. And I explained back in that lesson about how that affects different levels of their culture, or different areas of their culture. So we're going to expand on that. So food foraging, hunting, gathering, and fishing, is the oldest and most universal type of human adaptation and typically involves geographic mobility, okay, or nomadism, or just moving around, a group of people that are on the move all the time, or most of the time. So foraging was the only type of subsistence until around 10,000 years ago, when people adapted again and learned to domesticate plants and animals in some parts of the world. So we're talking about a cultural adaptation of learning to domesticate plants and animals and control their growth and life and so on, so that people could eat them and benefit in that way. So that's a cultural adaptation. However, if you were taking my physical anthropology class or biological anthropology class, we would also learn at the end of the semester about how this not only was a cultural adaptation, but changed human biology as well. So that's just a little interesting side note there. But foraging is the way that it was up until around 10,000 years ago. So we very recently started, I mean, in the timeline of human history and prehistory, very recently started food production. So here we're moving on to two other terms, and I don't want you to get hung up with these. using them the way they're used colloquially, I want you to pay attention to the anthropological definitions of these two terms. So horticulture is what you would generally define or describe as gardening, and then agriculture is something different. These two methods led to more permanent settlements, while pastoralism, or raising animals, usually raising herding animals, required mobility to seek out pasture and water. Cities began to develop as early as 5,000 years ago in some world regions due to these changes. So once people were able to settle, most likely using agriculture, cities began to develop. And again, we're very, very recent in human history did these things begin happening. So what exactly is subsistence? Let's clarify that again. In anthropology, subsistence means the way a society gets its food. And there are three main categories: food foraging, food producing, and industrialized. And we'll break down food producing into the different types later. Each mode or method of subsistence will involve not only natural resources, but also the technology to effectively utilize those resources. And when I say technology, I can mean tools or knowledge, okay? Technology includes the tools you use or the things you use and the knowledge of how to use them. Okay, here are some broken down and expanded types of subsistence, or as I called them at the beginning of the lesson, adaptive strategies: food foraging, pastoralism, which is raising domesticated animals, horticulture, which is growing crops with simple hand tools. Now, there are other things you can do with growing plants that make it more intense. That will move us on into agriculture. So in horticulture, you're not using fertilizer, or most likely, there are exceptions to every rule, but generally in horticulture, you're not using fertilizer. You're incorporating fallowing periods where plots of land are left alone to become overgrown with natural vegetation and regain soil fertility. So that's horticulture. With agriculture, it's different. It's going to be more intense, growing of plants or crops, using more labor. You're using permanent plots, so the land is being used continuously. Since you're not moving your plots, you need to amend the soil or add fertilizer to the soil to keep it fertile, to keep the land in use. Oftentimes irrigation will be used, or draft animals will be used for the plowing and transportation of crops. So you can see a big difference here. You might not think of it this way in everyday life, but there's a big difference between horticulture and agriculture, and it can make all the difference when we're talking about the development of cities and things like that. And then finally, there's industrial food production. So this brings us to the end of this segment of the lesson, part 1. When we move on to part 2, I'll go on to talk about food foraging. Thank you for listening.